The sun had barely begun its climb over the skyline of the city when Zohran Mamdani stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding not from nerves, but from the weight of the moment. The crowd in front of him was unlike any he had ever seen. Thousands of faces, young and old, bright-eyed and hopeful, had gathered in the square that had once seemed impossible to fill. For years, he had walked these streets, knocking on doors, listening to stories of struggle, and carrying with him the dreams of people who had long been ignored. Today, all those small, quiet victories, the late nights in cramped apartments, and the endless conversations with neighbors had led to this, a declaration of victory that was bigger than any election. It was a declaration of belief, that the power of the people could truly shape the world. Zohran's eyes scanned the crowd, catching glimpses of families who had endured eviction notices, immigrants who had waited years for recognition, teenagers who had fought for education, and seniors who had labored their whole lives for a chance to be heard. Each of them was a reminder of why he had entered politics, not for fame, not for personal glory, but for them. He could see their hope mirrored in their eyes, a reflection of the hope that had carried him through countless obstacles and moments when doubt threatened to creep in. He took a deep breath, letting the noise of the crowd wash over him, and for a moment, he simply allowed himself to feel the enormity of what was happening. When he began to speak, his voice was steady, but each word carried the weight of every promise he had made, every challenge he had faced, and every person who had believed in him even when the odds seemed insurmountable. "Today is not just a victory for me," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "It is a victory for every person who has ever been told that their voice does not matter. It is a victory for the families struggling to put food on the table, for the students fighting for a better education, for the communities that have been overlooked for far too long." The crowd erupted in cheers, and he felt a surge of humility. These were not just supporters, they were the lifeblood of the change he sought to bring. He spoke of the journey that had brought them to this day. He remembered the nights spent sitting in living rooms with families, hearing stories of hardship, frustration, and hope. He remembered the young woman who had cried as she told him she couldn't afford the medication her father needed, the immigrant father who worked 3 jobs yet could not make ends meet, the elderly man who had walked miles just to cast his vote. Each story had left a mark on him, shaping his vision of leadership. Leadership, he realized, was not about power, it was about service. It was about lifting others up, even when the path was hard, even when the victories seemed small. As he spoke, he felt a deep sense of connection with the crowd. This was not a moment of triumph for him alone, it was a shared triumph, a collective exhale of relief and joy from people who had long been overlooked. He remembered the volunteers who had walked door to door in rain and snow, the people who had handed out flyers, made calls, and believed in the message of community empowerment even when it seemed impossible to win. Their dedication had been relentless, and it was their belief that had made this moment real. Zohran understood that this victory was theirs as much as it was his. It was a testament to what could happen when ordinary people come together to fight for justice, fairness, and dignity. Amid the applause and chants, Zohran shared stories of unexpected moments that had defined the campaign. There was the young boy who had offered to sweep the campaign office floors for free just to be part of something bigger than himself. There was the woman who had knitted scarves for volunteers during cold winter nights. There were small, seemingly insignificant acts of kindness that had, collectively, created a wave of hope and solidarity that could not be ignored. These were the quiet heroes of the movement, and today, they were as much part of the victory as any speech or ballot count. The emotional climax of his speech came when he spoke of the people who had inspired him to keep moving forward, even in the face of setbacks. "There is a single mother here tonight," he said, pointing to a woman in the crowd whose eyes were glistening with tears, who works 2 jobs, yet still found the strength to volunteer, to help her neighbors, to teach her children that their voices matter. She, and millions like her, are why we are here. They remind us that real power is not in offices or titles, it is in compassion, in perseverance, in the courage to believe in a better future. The crowd erupted once more, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Every person in that square felt it, that intangible, profound sense that together, they could shape a future defined not by fear or division, but by empathy and collective action. After the speech, Zohran walked through the crowd, shaking hands, hugging families, and listening to stories that had not been shared in years. he met an elderly man who had once doubted whether anyone would ever fight for his neighborhood. Tears streamed down the man's face as he told Zohran, "You've given us hope when we had none left." In that moment, Zohran felt the deepest sense of fulfillment he had ever known. Politics, he realized, was never about winning. It was about touching lives, creating spaces where people could dream, and proving that compassion could be a guiding force even in the roughest of battles. The victory was not without challenges, of course. Zohran knew the path ahead was filled with systemic obstacles, skeptical opponents, and the endless grind of governance. But in that crowd, he saw the faces of people who had walked alongside him, who had believed in the impossible, and he knew that with them, no challenge was insurmountable. The triumph of the election was only the beginning. The real work, the transformative work, lay ahead. And he felt ready to serve, to listen, to fight for policies that would uplift communities, and to ensure that the era of people's power was not just a slogan, but a lived reality. As night fell, the city square glowed with the energy of celebration and hope. Children waved flags, volunteers hugged one another, and the hum of conversation carried stories of gratitude and dreams. Zohran stepped back from the stage for a moment, looking out over the sea of people who had made this victory possible. He reflected on the journey, on the sacrifices, the long nights, the doubts, and the triumphs. And he felt a profound sense of peace. Leadership, he realized, was not a title, it was a responsibility, a calling to elevate others, to listen deeply, and to act with unwavering integrity. In the weeks that followed, Zohran Mamdani and his team worked tirelessly to translate the energy of the election into meaningful action. Policies were crafted with the input of communities, new programs were launched to support families in need, and initiatives were introduced to amplify voices that had long been silenced. Each step reinforced the truth he had always known, that change is only possible when people are empowered to take it into their own hands, and that leadership is strongest when it serves rather than dominates. Years later, as stories of that historic election were told, people would remember not just the victory itself, but the spirit behind it. They would recall a politician who listened more than he spoke, who acted with humility and courage, and who believed unwaveringly in the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. They would remember the tears, the cheers, the late nights in neighborhoods where hope had once seemed fragile. And most importantly, they would remember that the era of people's power had begun, not because of one person, but because of a collective dream nurtured by empathy, resilience, and the unshakable belief that every life mattered. Zohran Mamdani's victory was more than a political milestone, it was a symbol of possibility, a reminder that when people come together with vision and compassion, they can transform not just their own lives, but the lives of generations to come. And as the city slept that night, the lights of homes glowing in quiet streets, there was a sense of something new awakening, a belief that power, when rooted in service and humanity, could indeed change the world.